Every now and then, you run across someone who seems to exist more in stories than in history. Roy Wooliver is one of those people. Depending upon who's telling it, Roy was a musical genius, a drifter, a petty thief, a hired dance fiddler, a man who never seemed to own a fiddle of his own. Maybe all of the above. The facts didn't always agree. The stories certainly didn't. But there was one thing almost everybody agreed on. Roy could play. That's what set me looking for the rest of the story. Not just Roy himself, but how someone could leave behind so little and still be remembered so vividly. Roy died in 1964, nearly 20 years before I was born. Everything I know about him comes from people who took the time to remember him. People like Gene Goforth, John Hartford, Hal Teague, and my longtime friend and mentor, Dr. Howard Marshall, whose book, Keep It Old Time, helped me separate documented history from stories passed from one generation to the next. Some of those stories can be verified, others can't. But taken together, they paint a picture of a man who left a mark on Missouri fiddling that's still being talked about today. So, who was Roy Wooliver? The more I read about Mr. Wooliver, the more I realize something. Almost nobody described him the same way. Howard Marshall gives us the historical record. Gene Goforth gave us the musician's perspective. John Hartford gave us the storyteller's version. Put them together, and a picture starts to emerge. Roy spent most of his life wandering the hills and hollers of the eastern Ozarks. Shannon County, Depp County, Reynolds County, Phelps County, places where a person could still make a little money playing a country dance on Saturday night, work on a farm for a few days, and then move on to the next community. He never seems to have stayed anywhere very long. Hartford remembered Roy as a little scrunched-up drifter who never seemed to own a fiddle. He'd just simply borrow yours. He'd help cut some firewood, do a few chores around the place, maybe sleep in the barn, and by morning he'd be gone. Whether every detail happened exactly that way isn't really the point. Enough people remembered Roy that way for the story to survive. The documented history tells us something. Roy's life wasn't an easy one. He spent several stretches in the Missouri State Pen. Most of the stories involve petty theft. One of Gene Goforth's favorites was about Roy stealing a man's watch, serving time in prison, getting out, and then going back and stealing that very same watch again. Gene always laughed when he told that story. Not because stealing is funny, because somehow it was just Roy. Dr. Marshall points out that while Roy's run-ins with the law are well documented, they aren't the whole story. The people who knew him rarely started by talking about his time in prison. They started by talking about the music. That's an important distinction. Roy wasn't remembered because he got into trouble. He was remembered because, somewhere between the mistakes, he played the fiddle in a way nobody forgot. Maybe that's why the stories have lasted. The trouble makes for colorful storytelling, but it's the music that kept his name alive. And that's where the story takes another turn. Because unlike so many old-time fiddlers whose music disappeared with them, somebody had the foresight to bring a tape recorder. For all the stories that have been told about Roy Wooliver, there's one thing we don't have to guess about. We can hear him play. That might not sound remarkable today, but it almost didn't happen. In February of 1958, a young John Hartford made his way to the eastern Ozarks with a reel-to-reel tape recorder. He'd been hearing stories about Roy, just as so many others had, and he knew there was one person who might be able to help, Gene Goforth. Hartford understood that if Gene was there was a good chance Roy would show up too. He was right. What followed was an afternoon of visiting, storytelling, and some incredible fiddle playing. Hartford played banjo, his friend Marvin Hawthorne backed him on guitar, and the tape recorder quietly captured something nobody could have known would matter nearly 70 years later. One of my favorite moments isn't even a tune. It's the conversation between the tunes, the stories between the tunes, the laughter. The way musicians visit with one another when there's no audience to impress and no clock on the wall. At one point, the conversation turns to Hamilton Ironworks, a tune that's become closely associated with Roy Wooliver. Gene credits Roy with the tune. Roy brushes it aside. He insists that he learned it from an old fiddler years before. Whether that's true or not, we'll probably never know. But I love what that exchange tells us. Roy wasn't interested in taking credit. He was interested in playing. That's something you hear over and over from the old-time musicians I admire. The tune always comes first. The recognition doesn't matter nearly as much. When Gene Goforth talked about Roy years later, he didn't remember him because he'd been in prison. He didn't remember him because he'd wandered from one community to another. He remembered him because Roy taught him expression. I think that's one of the finest compliments one fiddler can give another. Anybody can learn the notes. Expression is something entirely different. It's the reason you can recognize a fiddler after just a few measures. It's personality. It's phrasing. It's everything that lives between the notes. And after listening to those old recordings, I think I understand what Gene meant. Roy Wooliver never made a commercial record. He left behind very little that we can hold in our hands. But he left something much harder to preserve. A way of playing. A way of thinking about a tune. And because Gene remembered, because John Hartford carried a tape recorder, because Dr. Marshall spent decades gathering the pieces, we can still hear it today.
Well, we'll try another hearing aid. I'm going to try something.
If you'd like to hear the recordings mentioned in this episode, you'll find links in the show notes, including Hamilton Ironworks and other recordings that are available to listen to free online. You'll also find information about Dr. Howard Marshall's Keep It Old Time book, which was an invaluable resource while researching Roy Wooliver's story. I hope you'll take some time to explore them. They're well worth it. You can also visit my website for free recordings, photographs, and more stories behind the music. I'm John P. Williams. Thanks for listening. Let's pull another tape off the shelf.
That is? Money Mother.
Oh, Money Mother. Dr. Gray used to play.